Well, definitely. Thank you. Yes, this is William Chappell. I am the chairperson emeritus for the Planning Commission, stepping in for Blake Venturtune. Calling the meeting agenda for the Planning Commission and City Council joint workshop to order. Planning Commission does not have a quorum, so we are calling this a group gathering between City Council and the Planning Commission. Shall we stand for the flag salute? I pledge allegiance to the flag, United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, be seated. I will call the roll call for the Planning Commission. As I said before, this is William Chappell. Commissioner Chris Weller. Chris Molly. Commissioner Don. Here. Right here. And absent, Commissioner Venturtune is excused absence, and then Commissioner Bradley and Commissioner Preston are present. Do you want to call your authority or me too?
You can.
All right.
Ready to go.
Councilmember McHenry.
Here.
Councilmember Naplin.
Here.
Councilmember Isaacson. Councilmember Supple. Here. Councilmember Schaefer. Councilmember Mercer. Here. And Councilmember Kufeld. All right. Can I have are we going to make motions for approvals, agendas and things?
No, can't.
Okay. Any announcements from staff?
Just announcements. So we talked a little bit about before the meeting started, but because we're doing a gathering, it means that you can't talk to other council members or planning commissioners about the meeting. But what we'll do is we'll send out the link to the audio video so they can take a look at it. And then we'll follow up at the next planning commission meeting and the next council meeting about getting comments back. It doesn't mean that you can't give comments to staff, because we'll still seek comments for a couple of weeks. It just means that I can't give official direction here. Thank you.
All righty, moving on. We have a lot of audience participation today. Do we have any comments from the audience? Please state your name and where you're from and your question or comment.
Do you want me to election? From you?
Yes, please.
Oh. My name is Mike Dell, and I'm a member of the advisory group that put together the parks and grants and recreation plan, and I'll speak a little bit about that. So, I also am a store trail mix for the Recreation Conservation Office for the state of Washington, and I have a lot of background in regards to trails development. And I wanted to say first, I just commend the people who put together the plan that you guys have now, of course, with them. And that is, the staff of the city, the consultants, and the people, of course, who have the advisory group. Because frankly, judging it from some of the other plans that I've seen over the last decade or so, it's a really nice piece of work. And we should be very proud of the input that was gathered in regards to it. The one thing that I would like to suggest to the council to consider is not just that I hope people approve the plan, but you also think about strategically next steps. And one of the probably the most important, and one of the reasons why this plan was put together in the first place was to be able to receive funding from the state RCO office in regards to funding the components in this particular plan. And two of the things that I think would help you score better in that very competitive process, because it's we give away millions and millions and millions of dollars every year. So there's cities big and small that are doing for these grants. Is that you consider that somewhere in the near future that you actually put together a ball parks department. And I think that is something that is really, really critical. you may want to also go down, the avenue of thinking about the Parks Commission. Because in both cases, they'll increase your ability in regards to getting these funding sources. And then the other thing is, I would hope that once you, pass this plan, that you create an avenue so that, a citizens, friends of Duval Parks, or whatever you want to call it, can be developed so that we can add value added to this plan, because as we all know, this community is full of people who volunteer, and the amount of potential volunteer activities, from getting rid of invasive species to building trails to signage, picking up litter, all that stuff is endless. And as the city grows, of course, having that, being able to mobilize that great ability that we have in this town makes us somewhat unique compared to other towns. And that's because of our demographic and people, the spirit that historically relied in this town. So to conclude, please consider approving this plan, but also thinking about next steps. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, please.
So I'm Lee Anderson, live up on English Street since 2003, so I'm new around the At Duval days, was hanging around the city hall office, watching the bands and whatnot, and you guys were handing out some questionnaires. I don't want to be premature, maybe that's what you plan on talking about. Well, I filled out a couple of those and talked to some of the nice ladies there about what could be done and what kind of things you're looking for. So I filled some of those out. I just wonder, are we going to talk about those things now? The arts and recreation, things like that. Is that going to be discussed at this thing? Some of the input that you got from it.
Laura Thomas, Community Development Director for the record, and I do remember you.
Okay.
Yeah, it was Cynthia, our city administrator, and myself, and Councilmember Naplin. We did the visioning exercise, and those were the cards. And so if you stay later in the meeting, the Planning Commission is actually going to be working on the vision exercise that's a result of that information. So at this evening's meeting, we're talking mostly about parks, but it still is part of that vision. And then we're also going to be talking about housing this evening, which is also part of that vision. So the answer is mostly yes, but specifically on the visioning exercise and what small town means, we're going to be doing that at the very end of the meeting with the Planning Commission.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, is there anything else? All right, thank you very much. Moving on, we'll go to the 2024 Parks, Trails, and Open Spaces Plan. Turn it over to Conservation Techniques.
Thank you, Steve Dew from Conservation Techniques. And I would just ask that Laura make some opening comments.
All right.
Thank you. And honestly, Mike did a great job as well, being on our committee. And so we started this project, not even quite a year ago. I think it's October, November. And we started out doing like a needs assessment, looking to see what we have, operation and maintenance. We look at like, what are those next future parks? We put together essentially an advisory committee and had several meetings with them this late winter and early spring. And then what we did with our consultant, with Steve's group, is then we take back a lot of that information from the committee, and then we start to put what we call the chapters together. And so now we've done a full review internally of the draft document that we worked on with, obviously with our consultant, but also with our committee as well. And now we're prepared to start having that conversation. The one thing that we're still working on, that we wanted to start this process, is we're doing some work on our CIP. That takes a little bit of effort and time, and it's always a little bit more towards the end. And so Larissa's actually working on it. We're all internally working on it. So we have kind of a draft, but we don't have all the details yet, but we will bring back more details for the CIP, but everything else is ready to roll. And I just wanted to say, make sure everybody remembers that Naomi is in our room too, our senior planner, and she's our project manager for most of our long-range planning for these 2 years. So Naomi, I don't know if you wanted to say anything really quick before we jump in?
Sure, yeah, I recognize a lot of faces here, and some I'm very familiar with, and I really appreciate all the work that everybody has put into helping us put this plan together. One thing that I do want to note is, we're submitting capital for those that are on the commission and city council, is that it's in draft one, hasn't been made clear yet. So it's really content, but we have a couple of other weeks, we have a revised schedule. We will be receiving that soon after this meeting, and then that's all I have. I really appreciate everybody's work and the volunteerism, and I have to say, I worked on managed other groups, and Duval's Parks, Trails, and Open Space Steering Committee, and all the other groups that pitched in and gave opinions. Really great, very unique. I really mean that to people that are. I really mean that's really active and engaged community, which makes it like.
We'll let, okay, we have it up. And so Steve is going to help walk us through the slides, and we can either do questions at certain points, because sometimes that works by subject. But if you have a question, feel free to put your hand up, and Commissioner, yes.
So for some reason I thought that since we didn't have a forum, we weren't supposed to interact, or how does that work?
That just means after this meeting, you can't interact with other council members that weren't at this meeting, so it doesn't break OPMA. Sorry, I didn't explain that well.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can have dialogue here. It's just that you don't want to take that dialogue and take it back and ask for opinions, which would create essentially a serial meeting.
Got it.
Perfect. Thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate that.
All right. On to me.
Yeah.
So we have a brief presentation to walk through, and some of this content is probably familiar to you from prior presentations over the survey or other elements of the plan, but just for continuity, wanted to give you a review of the overall purpose of the plan, touch on the community engagement process and a little of what we heard from the community, hit on some of the analysis that went into the plan, touch on goals, and briefly touch on recommended projects and capital investments before turning it back to Laura for next steps. So just as a reminder, the Parks, Trails, and Open Space Plan, or PTOS plan for short, is intended to be the city's 6-year, 20-year strategic guide for all things parks, trails, and open space. So about managing what you have, about planning for the future. But as Mike noted earlier, it's also a tool for the city to position itself for future grant efforts, leveraging, working with partnerships, and developing more grassroots efforts to make future investments in Duval's future parks system. So with regard to community engagement, let me go to the next one, we need a second try. We had a robust public process that really tapped into the community in a variety of different ways. We had a community survey, there was event tabling at multiple community events, an open house, and one's coming up in September.
Yes, the end of September.
And then several focus group discussions. The advisory steering committee met 4 times throughout the course of the process to give guidance and touch points with both planning commission and city council. With the intent really to just have an informed and inclusive process and engage the community. Overall, we had over 700 participants provide feedback, and a lot of that came through the community survey. So just touching on some of what we heard from the survey, nearly everybody who took the survey, 98%, feel that parks and recreation opportunities are either essential or important to the quality of life in Duval. Visitation is strong, with almost 90% saying they visit parks or open space in town at least monthly. with about 2/3 visiting weekly. So again, you've got strong usage of the park amenities that you've got in town here. Some of the top reasons for people coming out to the parks and open space, walking and running right there at the top. That's consistent with regional, state, and national information, where walking and running typically score at the top for reasons for getting out or types of exercise people are participating in. It also relates to the need and demand for spaces to do that. So trails and parks with paths, et cetera. Beyond that, the next grouping, relaxation events, fitness, river access, those are kind of the low cost, no cost opportunities. So a lot of people are engaged in those types of activities. And then it moves into more specialized types of activities, whether it's family oriented, being at the playground with kids or for picnics, then getting into sports and other more specialized activities. So two top priorities that came through the survey were to revitalize existing parks and to expand trail opportunities. And that came through a couple of different questions, one of which was a forced rank question where we said, here's 6 things, rank them in order 1 through 6. And that's the top 2 of that ranked order. Regarding the types of amenities people have interest in, walking trails, again, consistent with their interest in walking, but also some of those user conveniences like restrooms, parking, signage, but also expanding opportunities for play, whether it's nature play or play with water, like a splash pad, community gardens, and just a space to gather, whether it's picnic space or outdoor amphitheater or gathering spaces like that. Pickleball also came in as a strong option. That's founded in Washington. It's the fastest growing sport in the country, so no surprise that it showed up in the survey. So just synthesizing some of the core themes we heard from the survey, other public engagement, and kind of what we saw on the ground when our landscape architect visited all the park properties is just to synthesize this. One core theme is to take care of what we have. And by that, we mean renovating and upgrading your existing facilities, making sure they're safe, well-maintained, managed, working toward improvements of ADA compliance or American with Disability Act compliance, removing barriers to entry, things like providing for ramps into playgrounds or making sure that the surfacing in the playground area is accessible for mobility devices and for users of all abilities, things like that. Beyond that, also looking at communications and marketing, making sure that people are aware of what we have. That was one comment from the survey that, some people just don't know what's available, which limits their access to what's out there. And then the other core theme really is about expanding recreation opportunities, and that relates to the prior slide that showed interest in a lot of different amenities. So providing for more trails and trail connections, providing space for sport courts, for basketball, tennis, sport fields. That relates to the expansion of big rock golf fields, specifically the project, but also providing space for covered play, improving and managing your open spaces and natural areas, things like invasive species removal, and just taking care of vegetation. And then lastly, signage, informational displays, wayfinding, again, relating to the communications of letting people know what's available and how to interact with those spaces when they get there. So in terms of system analyses, we did a series of different types of analysis that looked at the parks and open space system through a few different lenses. One looked at park access and distribution, kind of the physical geographic where things are and who has access, but also from a physical accessibility, kind of an ADA perspective. Again, looking at making sure that what you have in the ground is usable for people with all abilities. And then generally looking at your parks and open space system through the lens of the places and spaces. Is there a variety? Is there diversity? Are things easily accessible? And then just, again, thinking through the lens of planning for the future, So one of the series of analyses that you see in the plan draft and in the packet is a lot of different maps that have these two-tone colors to them. And from prior work session, I think I've reviewed this, but to just touch on the highlights, the intent here is to look at distribution, so geographic distribution of what you have. And we did this through looking at the park system as a whole by looking at the travel sheds for the different parks, but we also looked at it through the lens of the different amenities. So whether it's playgrounds or sport fields or trails, we did mapping based on each of those types of amenities. And really it's a way to show who in the community has geographic access to what you own, what you have on the ground. So this particular map is the travel shed map, combines all of the different park classifications, the community park, the neighborhood park, pocket park, and 2 different distances. So the darker pink is a 1/4 mile and the lighter pink is a 1/2 mile. So effectively, we put pin drops on the map and say from this legitimate entry point to a park, travel along the roads or distances, 1/2 mile, 1/4 mile, and we connect all the dots. So what you see in the colored tone is those are the areas of town where people live within either a 1/4 mile or a 1/2 mile of park. The areas in white represent those areas that are effectively gaps. So folks in the white areas have to travel more than a 1/2 mile to get to a part of these classifications. So it's just a tool to represent what it is on the ground and who has access. And a map like this also helped inform looking at opportunities for filling those gaps through targeted acquisitions for the future. Another way to look at the system is to compare it to some national data sets. So the National Recreation and Park Agency, NRPA Association, puts together annual data sets from around the country. Municipalities do surveys annually that provide data to the data set, and that data set is made available to everybody to take a look at. That data then gets aggregated as medians for all of the agencies across the country, but it also gets segmented by population size. So for Duval, we can compare how the city looks against all municipalities in the data set, as well as those that are of a similar population breakdown. The smallest breakdown they have is communities of 20,000 and up. So the chart is just a way to, again, represent where Duval is today, that snapshot in time against some of the comparables of the national data set. One thing to point out is you'll see little green and yellow boxes off to the side of the chart. Where it's green, it means that the city is either meeting or exceeding the medians for those 2 data sets. If it's yellow, it's below the median. So that's just a simple way to call out where the city is matching or where additional attention might be needed going forward. So the city's doing well in terms of its provision of parks and open space in general, in terms of residents per park, in terms of acres of parkland per 1,000 people, which is kind of a generalized metric that a lot of agencies look at, as well as the number of miles of trail. So as a small community and as a community that doesn't have a formal parks department and has limited staffing, the other metrics on this chart make sense where Duval is a little below those national standards or national averages because of your specific situation of having less staff, no formal department, et cetera. So when you look at FTEs per 10,000 residents, you're less than the median. When you look at operating expenses and things like that, you're less than, but that's again, typical given the size of this community and the kind of framework that you're working on.
So question about that?
Yeah.
Is that a negative thing to be spending less if it's still producing the parts that people are satisfied with? Isn't that a good thing?
It's a non-judgmental thing. I'm just calling it out as this is a factoid.
Okay.
And that, it's again, a snapshot in time.
Mhm.
So as the city develops more land, because you do have some underdeveloped properties, or as the city acquires additional property to fill some of those gaps, there may be a growth in operations staff to manage that. So it might get adjusted in the future, but today it's really just a snapshot in time, and it's a non-judgmental thing. So
Okay.
here's where you fit, and it's not good or bad, it's just information.
Okay.
One other sort of related question, same slide, and it stood out just a bit of anomaly versus the other data on the slide. In most cases, all agencies were higher in terms of budget, in terms of spend, in terms of, for the staffing component, it seemed to be inversed. It was like 8.9 for all agencies, and it was 11 for cities less than, or municipalities less than 20,000, which I found a little odd that they would have a higher median staffing level than all agencies. Is there anything behind those numbers, or is that just, the numbers from the data set?
Yeah, so with regard to the FTEs in particular, because the data set is looking at municipalities across the country and also municipalities that even in.
So it's going to be greater than less than 20,000 plus everyone else. So the averages just come out. Right?
Yeah, I guess the other point I was going to make is that many other jurisdictions also offer recreation programming. So those that do programming have staff to do the programming, which is an inflated sort of way to look at the generic number. So with Duval proper, not having a formal department, not having recreation programming, you have a lot fewer FTEs than what would be a comparable agency, even in that small bracket of those 120,000. So that is the biggest variant.
I just need to, because I want to make sure that, because we don't have a quorum, to keep us in bounds. And so council cannot interact, council planning commission cannot interact with one another, meaning they can't iterate off of each other's comments. We can answer questions to staff and the consultant, so just making sure that we stay within those bounds. Thank you.
Yeah. One here and then.
The full-time employees was 4.4 per 10,000 residents. How is that? Because Duval has less than 10,000 residents. Is that city employees or the people that are working parks?
It represents city employees doing parks related work. So park operations, and I don't remember the other numbers that were part of that.
It's a full-time equivalent, so it's not a whole person. It's a percentage of a person that works and does those things. So I don't know if that helps answer the question or not.
Yeah, okay.
And as a number relative to 10,000, it's fewer than 4.4 FTEs proper, right? Because there's what, 8,000.
Just 85.
Yeah.
Councilwoman Beckman.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to ask about is when it said acres of parkland per 1,000 residents. I'm not quite sure what acres we're using, and I think there was at one point, it kind of follows through a lot through the plan. I'm trying to understand if McCormick Park, most of it is not developed, and when I was looking at the definition, it's that distinguished open space from actual parks is that it's distinguished natural lands from parks developed for active or programmed recreation. So very little of McCormick Park is that. And so I'm just trying to understand how what we used here and kind of in other places, it seems like the maybe the open spaces, I don't know if it included McCormick Park as separated into the open space portion of McCormick Park and the developed, because that could really skew, where the numbers were, because there's so much of McCormick Park that isn't just not developed yet, it's undevelopable. It's a floodplain, wetlands, mitigation trees have been planted. So I just am trying to, I think that would help me to understand either if, how that is accounted for. I think it's been brought up before in another meeting too.
Yeah, great point. And for the purpose of this chart and the chart that follows this, where I'm comparing to the national data set, because the national data set doesn't cleanly segregate park types, it just does aggregates. We used aggregate numbers. So these numbers are reflective of the total park and open space system acres. So the full size of McCormick, the full size of the open space that's North Hill. So everything combined gets to these numbers.
So that could potentially make it look like we have in the green because we're so high, because we do have a lot of those open spaces.
And we actually talked about that internally, so we're gonna go through like an exercise and push them out so that we can actually kind of come up with what we'll call the Duval hybrid.
Okay.
And for this purpose, it's really like what Steve said, which is based on the national standards, where they put them all into one bucket.
Yeah, and again, the intent to represent this information here tonight for you is just, again, snapshot in time of how the city's comparing to other agencies, for the purpose of just saying, are we going in the right direction, wrong direction, or where might we be? So again, data points that help lead into recommendations about policy, whether it's acres per thousand standards or something like that, or specific projects to fill gaps or otherwise. We're not necessarily suggesting in this plan that you utilize any one data point to make all decisions fine. So we did multiple variations on the analyses to give you different lenses to think about the overall parking space system. So again, whether it's the distribution through the travel sheds, or numerics through these metrics, or just looking at the amenities that you're offering, you have a different way to think about the types of amenities that you can put on the ground to benefit the residents. Next.
I believe we don't have the public comment period. Essentially was at the beginning of the meeting, but what we'll do is I'll ask the planning commission, we come forward here, if we can have a second public comment session. We have somebody in the audience that has some comments. Thank you.
So the next slide, similar format, similar data set, again, using the NRPA, National Recreation Park Association data, but this time looking specifically at different types of amenities. So you can see a list of about 12 amenities there. And again, the all agencies column is the national full data set, and then the subset of that for communities 20,000 less. So in this quick snapshot, you can see Duval matches up quite well against the other comparables for the different types of amenities it offers on a per capita basis. The two areas really where Duval's a little light relative to the national numbers is for baseball fields and rectangular sport fields. So multi-use sport fields, so soccer, lacrosse, those sorts of amenities.
This is just really quick. One thing that's unique about Duval is we're kind of an island and we're surrounded by lots of population that's unincorporated King County. So we are their park provider. There's not really a King County park that serves them. So I don't know if that's reflected anywhere in here, but I think it was reflected in the plan, just so that when we apply for grants, there's really an understanding that we are providing parks for even more than just our jurisdiction. So if the state or the county is saying, oh, yeah, you know, we've given a lot to this area, it's like, well, we're providing parks for this huge area all around us.
And that's a really good comment, because we actually talked about that at both our steering committees and as an internal group as well. And so we definitely we understand that, we acknowledge it, but we can add some more language within our plan. I mean, there is some language in there that talks about recreation, and that we are, you know, the recreation area for essentially, you know, rural King County around us. And so we have put it in there, and if we ever, when we do, not whenever, but when we do go out for grants, you know, those are the things that we would add as details into our grant applications. But we do want to make sure we have it in our plan as well. Marissa?
So one of the conversations that kind of spurred from that, and that Mike mentioned at the beginning of the meeting when he made his comments, was the parks, what's it called, the big, when you have a big park district that's outside of your city limits type of thing, kind of like how we have our future expansion for our water service area. It's 5.6 square miles. We're only 2.5, but that is our future expansion to serve, right, for water. So I mean, that was one of the things that I know that we talked about in steering committee meetings and stuff like that. So
yeah, one of the policy recommendations will be for the community council and planning commission to look at regional parks board.
And then another way to look at a snapshot in time is to look at what was in the 2008 plan for a service standard, which was a acres per 1,000 metric. So that was structured around two different park types, so community parks and neighborhood parks. And in that 2008 plan, the service standard for community parks was 8 acres per 1,000 and 2 acres per 1,000 neighborhood parks. So what we've done is taken those acres for those classifications and compared them to today's population to a projected population out to 2035. And that projected population is at this point a loose estimate forecast figure, not final. But basically what it shows is that using the metrics or the standard from the 2008 plan for community parks and for neighborhood parks, the city currently meets or exceeds those standards. With population growth, there will be a future deficit for park acres. So it actually aligns quite well with the distribution travel shed map that I showed earlier, in the sense that you have some gap areas, and those gap areas could fill if additional acquisitions occur. And if that happens, then you'll continue to meet the standard that we set forward in the 2008 plan. So for the purpose of this draft, we're not recommending any changes to that service standard. So transitioning into goals and policies. Again, this effort was to look at what was in the 2008 plan, look at what was in the most recent version of the comprehensive plan, as well as other plan inputs, watershed plan, other planning documents, to think about how to clean up, restructure, and bring to a common current day perspective on goals and policies for the city of Duval. So in the 2008 plan, it included 9 goals, and within those 9 goals were 63 policy statements. So through this process, we've shuffled the deck a little bit in terms of the goals, cleaned them up, reduced the number of goals to 7, and structured them around themes. So they're topic oriented. So there's goals around acquisition, there's goals around park and open space management, development, administration, et cetera. So through this process, again, we've restructured the goals topically, and then we've either edited, revised, eliminated, or added policies to get to about 27 or 67 policies overall, 17 of which are new policies, and then we can work through some of those amendments in the next set of slides. So one piece is that in terms of the goals, I mentioned 7 goals. One of those 7 goals is a new goal around acquisitions and expansion, so park and open space acquisitions. And that really was to capture some of the policy statements from the 2008 plan and give them a place to be that was consistent with the way in which we were thinking about thematically organizing the goals. So the policies aren't necessarily new under that. We just put a new umbrella of acquisition and expansion as a goal title. Within the realm of new policies, I mentioned that there were 17 new policies. Those include things like policies specific to community engagement, making sure that the public has a means to participate and get involved with talking and deciding about what goes into the park system, communications, as well as asset management, inventories, ADA compliance, including art, environmental interpretation, coordinating trailheads, and just general operational efficiency, best management sorts of policy statements, things that were added in to just, again, bring the city's suite of policies up to current standards. So in terms of the goals, these are the goal topic areas. So inclusion and accessibility, the acquisition expansion is the new one I referenced, design development, open space, cultural history, trails, and management administration. So in the next set of slides, I'll walk through each goal title language to just show you how we edited the goal, but within those goals, policies were also amended. So the first goal about inclusion and accessibility, not much of a change from the 2008 plan language. Really just identifying and adding some content to make sure that the wording suggests that all ages and abilities should be provided for and within the city parks, trails, and open spaces. So anything that's underlined is new, and then on the next couple of slides, you can see strikeout. It's obviously a strikeout. But again, within that goal, the policies cover things like providing for diverse recreation, accommodating user conveniences like restrooms, signage, things like that, as well as wayfinding communications. And within this goal also is the idea of a park board. Again, something that Mike had mentioned earlier from the advisory committee sessions. Goal 2, again, new goal language, just again to capture some of the policies that were in the 2008 plan. And the goal is to expand park and open spaces through the acquisitions to accommodate residential growth and improve equitable access to recreation amenities. So here again, specific policy language is about identifying and pursuing acquisitions, specifically in Old Town or along the Snoqualmie River, coordinating with other city plans, as well as coordinating with residential developments to either see how they can help provide city-owned or provide their own HOA style park and open spaces. Design and development maintenance, just cleaning up the language, really basically says the same thing. And within this is a set of policies around asset management and knowing what you have and managing that data set over time, providing for ADA compliance, especially with new improvements and upgrading old improvements to be compliant. With future park development, doing it through the lens of low impact design as appropriate, in part to help manage maintenance costs, looking for volunteers to help support park improvements and conducting site master plans or specific park concept plans to guide the future of individual parks. Again, this plan is an overarching 30,000 foot level plan. It doesn't dive into the details of park design for any individual site. So that would be an outgrowth of this plan. Right. Open space protection, really no changes from the 2008 plan, just carrying forward the goal as written, and the policies include things like sensitive barrier protection, habitat protection, vegetation management, invasive species, those sorts of things, but also making sure that there's opportunity for environmental education, stewardship, partnerships, and interpretation. Next. Culture and history, again, a carryover from 2008 plan. In this, we're just trying to recognize the value added of the cultural and historical assets that people have and their roles in the parks and open space system. Through that, using those assets for community education and interpretation, and exploring opportunities for the future to install additional public art or provide for cultural events that really build on that foundation. Trails and connectivity. You can see the strikeouts and the new language, basically just cleaning up the language a little bit to reinforce the notion of having a cohesive and safe park or trail system for pedestrians and cyclists. And the policies cover a range of things, including providing for connections across the city, relying on the transportation element of the comprehensive plan, and also coordinating partners. So whether it's the county, T's, I should say, or other agencies to find ways to expand the trails, connect to regional connections, but also internally to look at rights of way or other street-oriented connections to fill those trail segments over time. The last goal around management and administration is intended to just strengthen the language to help the city provide for supporting the park and open spaces over time. Through that is looking at funding alternatives, the notion of a metropolitan park district, the notion of a park foundation or a nonprofit, other partnerships like with the school district, and then updating the capital plan periodically to make sure that the project list is fresh and up to date. Thinking about capital planning, the last couple of slides really will wind down the presentation, and it's really to just give you a visual of some of the projects that are part of the draft. And again, this is all draft and recommendations at this stage, so feedback is welcome. 3 different graphics here. This first one is focusing on renovation projects. So the pins on the map just reflect the locations for the bullet list. So within the realm of renovation projects, ADA enhancements is one area that is consistent across a number of park sites. So Fox Hollow, Taylor's Landing, and even Judd Park could use a little ADA or universal accessibility improvements. Beyond that, replacing the log cabin at Taylor Park with a restroom shelter, replacing the roof or replacing the shelter at Taylor's Landing, and then enlarging the off-leash dog area at Doherty Farms. This next one captures park development and park acquisitions. So again, relying on the distribution travel shed map I showed earlier, we kind of zoomed into those areas that were gap areas to see if there was any opportunity for larger lots that are either underdeveloped or undeveloped and potentially well suited for a future park site. That's what those stars represent on the map. So we've got 6 different areas that could be potential target areas. They're not specific to a parcel, but they are generalized areas in which a park could be well suited, and there is a reasonable assertion that you can find something in those areas for a future park. The yellow pins on the map represent development improvements, whether site planning or park development. The first big one really is Big Rock Ball Field expansion project that's currently underway in terms of master planning, but also looking to do a site master plan for McCormick Park as well as Doherty Farmstead to really define the future of those properties. So specifically with McCormick Park, it is a large site that has limited development capabilities, but what could be on that site with environmental sensitive development to let people use it in a reasonable and sensitive manner that gives people access to more of the property. So a site plan for that is recommended early. But also looking at Lake Rasmussen and the idea anyway of a pier or dock with pathway and maybe a picnic area just to improve that site. The old water tank site currently has some neighborhood improvements that are kind of park-like. So formalizing the space to be a park would be good for the future. So those are just some representations of future park development. Next. So the next one is about the trail connections. So the proposed trail map identifies different trail types, classifications, regional being like ESBT or TOLT, kind of wider, can accommodate multiple uses, bicyclists and runners, pedestrians all at the same time. But then other smaller connections, just linking parks together or within parks, or kind of the park pathway style, smaller scale trails. So as you can see by the pins, it's really spread across the community to identify future trail connections with spines in a north-south orientation through the power line area, as well as onto the eastern side of the city, connecting up to the high school with several smaller community connections in between and some park-specific connections like maybe interior trails at McCormick Park or the Farmstead property. Thanks. So that wraps up the overview, and I'll just hit next steps really quick on our side. So at this point, again, as Naomi had mentioned, this is in its kind of Word version draft for your review and feedback. It will move into kind of a prettier version in the next month. But going forward, the idea is to come back to Planning Commission as via a formal hearing, and also City Council for formal hearing. And Naomi, do you want to mention the timelines while Laura's outside?
Yeah, it might be better to show you, or I can email it afterwards, but right now, this is the timeline for the first plan. Today we're presenting the draft of a copy which contains the most important part, which is the content in it, which is the policy informing document. We have already transmitted a copy of this draft document as required to the Washington State Department of Commerce. And next we'll be transmitting it to RCO, as well as issuing a project action determination, a CBA determination. So those are all procedural items. However, as far as involvement, being able to provide comments when this will be presented again, the next time it's going to be in the meeting and being presented will be during the public hearing, which needs to be hosted separately by the Planning Commission and then again by the City Council. So the Planning Commission is going to host the public hearing on the proposed open space plan, which at that point will be in a more designed version, and that date is going to be October 9th. Then on October 15th, just a few days later, City Council will be also hosting that public hearing on the same plan. So those are two opportunities there. Following that, on October 23rd, the Planning Commission will be presented to by staff, and we will be requesting a recommendation to City Council for adoption. So at that point, if the Planning Commission chooses, we inform that the plan submission as to be recommended for adoption. If that takes place, then on November 5th, City Council will then consider adopting the Parks Trails and Open Space Plan, and at that point we'll have an official document. So we're getting closer to that point. I was, for the rest of us, going to be cleaning this up, making it presentable in its final form, as well as staff participating in a lot of administrative stuff, which isn't exciting for anybody probably here. And then when we get to October, there's going to be a number of meetings. So that's when we're going to have another chance for those that are watching this recorded or watching it live. That will be your opportunity, because that is a public hearing. So at that point, public comments will be invited as well. That's all I have.
So, any other questions or comments? I know you've got other stuff on your agenda.
Yes.
One thing I noticed is that, disc golf was asked about, in a survey, and it looks like disc golf came in pretty close to where basketball, baseball, soccer, bike skills kind of all clustered around the same percentage of interested. And, I was just wondering if, it didn't look like that was really included in some of the other paragraphs where it talked about possible projects or, I think in one place there was something like alternative sports. It wasn't really listed in there. And I'm just wondering if it could be listed in those other areas as possibilities, because I really see it as a relatively inexpensive installation that people could enjoy, you know, maybe in McCormick Park or some other places, just kind of activate some of our natural areas. And it seems like quite a few people are interested, and it seems like that would be a much less expensive thing than building fields. I mean, we are building fields too, but anyway, I was just curious if there was a reason why that wasn't called out specifically as being something we might work on.
Probably not a good reason for excluding it, but we often would leave some of that type of decision to the site master plan level. So as I look at the system, McCormick Park or the Farmstead site are probably the two larger sites that can accommodate something like this small. So we can work on the language to beef that up a little.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. It did look like people were interested in it, and I just didn't want to leave it out as a possibility.
Yep.
Okay.
Excuse me, what activity were you talking about?
Disc golf.
Yes, of course. After that.
Okay. I think, you know, now would be appropriate time, to ask if there was,
Oh, our city administrator.
oh. She went away.
No, I'm here. Hi, everyone. Just a reminder to make sure that any questions and comments are directed specifically to staff or the consultant and answered by staff or consultant, and not to iterate amongst each other.
There we go. Is it, I know we had, Mrs. Thomas had mentioned, opening up to, we have questions from the audience again. I know it's not on the agenda. There was some questions.
Laura's on time.
All right, okay, well, let's,
This is Cynthia. I can help answer that question. So you cannot take a vote on whether or not you would like to open public comment. I would suggest that the chair take exercise their discretion in deciding whether or not they would like to open public comment for any of those in the audience, and determine the time period in which you would like to have an open public comment, but you cannot deliberate or vote on that decision tonight.
all right. Well, the questioner has left, so why don't we move on to Eco Northwest with our comprehensive plan housing elements.
Nicole, she's right there. She's back.
Well, good evening. My name is Nicole Stickney. I'm here with AHBL, and we are the prime consultant working on the comprehensive plan update. Eco Northwest is a consultant to us that helping with the housing element. And so they're the principal authors of what you read in preparation for this meeting tonight. But I was the one that was able to come tonight to talk to you. So I'm excited to bring this to you. Hopefully I can answer any questions that you may have. And if not, we will be sure to get questions back to Jennifer Cannon and the others at Eco Northwest, and then and get the answer back to Bill. So I do have some slides tonight. I do welcome any interruptions if there's anything I need to clarify or questions that come about. And I will give you a little bit of an outline just to explain what we're talking about. So we can go to the next slide, please. No problem. Again, so Jennifer Cannon at Echo Northwest is the primary author, and I'll be presenting tonight. And that's just a quick look at what the looks like. So this is my sort of rough agenda for tonight and what I plan to talk to you about. I want to go over the element purpose and the background information, a lot of studying and fact finding was done for this. We want to go over what our the kind of the high points of our findings. And that will include a presentation of data and statistics. And then we have some discussion prompts. Housing is such a complex issue, so I want to make sure that we're recognizing those complexities and some of the limitations that we have along the way. And then we'll have a guided discussion where we're reviewing the specific goal and policy language, those edits and changes that we proposed. One thing I did want to highlight is that when you look at your packet, you will see track changes for those parts which are the goals and policies, because we really wanted to call your attention to where we're proposing maybe a pivot or an expansion of a particular theme. For the rest of the document, it would have been so letting us see if we'd shown all the track changes. So, and it's really, we're updating information, right? A lot of just factual based. So that is why you don't see the track changes for the balance of the document, but it was super important in the goals and policies. So that's why we organized it that way. And the next slide, please. Just a quick description here about, and as a reminder, as you've probably heard before, this is a part of the greater effort to update your comprehensive plan, which is your 20-year plan for growth here in Duval. The land use element being the primary and principal element to that. And this is all developed within the framework of the Growth Management Act. Housing, you can see is on the right-hand side of parks, trails, open space we talked about just a few minutes ago. All of these things are going to be presented in different parts and pieces, and then at the end it all comes together into one plan. But these are the different components that are required, again, under the Growth Management Act, or will be required. Climate and resiliency is called out here, something that's coming along. And then public involvement, it's not its own element, but we still list it here because it is such an important component to what we're doing. All along the way, we are making sure that we're providing those public engagement opportunities and getting information out. All right, the next slide. Without further ado, let's talk about the housing element. I want to explain that the housing element has a defining role in ensuring the provision of adequate and quality housing for existing and future residents, and that is for all economic segments of the community. So that's a pretty tall order, but that's what we're trying to be able to promote, foster, and facilitate. So in this housing element, you're going to see that we have set out some specific strategies to accommodate the projected housing needs that have been set out sort of by the state initially, but then more specifically by King County through their countywide planning policies. And I'll show you what that looks like. Again, we're looking at a 20-year time horizon. We also, as we have in the past, want to talk about how we're going to, as a city, work to enhance neighborhoods. How do we support any maintenance or improvement of existing housing stock? These types of concerns are also paramount. And then, as I said, again, goals and policies, that's kind of the main driver behind all of this. So we always want to make sure that those goals and policies are adequate to provide a framework to meet the short-term and long-term housing needs of the city. And really, this should be the driver behind a lot of decisions that are made with your development regulations, things like that, when you're looking at proposals in the community, but also how you're doing your budget, how you're doing your priorities in the city. What are you doing in order to make sure that you are advancing the housing element? You know, it's all gonna come together in the future. All right, and the next slide. This slide is just to kind of bring you up to speed. If you've never looked at the city's existing comprehensive plan, this is what you would see already in that document, kind of where we started from, if you will. This is a list of those high level goals and policies that are already written into the existing or the current plan. So in case you're new or unfamiliar, or you just need a refresher, this is where we're starting from. So it says things like we want to preserve, maintain, and enhance existing neighborhoods. We want to promote high quality design. We want to enable a variety of housing types for changing demands and for 20-year growth targets. That's something the city set out to do in the past. We want to help meet the affordable housing needs. So that's particularly for low and moderate income folks. I'll highlight that real quick. We're actually even more specific now moving forward. The Growth Management Act says there's actually more tiers. It's not just low and moderate income. There's actually, it's more refined now. Next, permanent and temporary housing needs to be provided for residents with disabilities, healthcare needs, or other special needs. And your current plan also addresses pedestrian scale mixed use development and sets out that this fulfills a unique and attractive niche in the overall housing mix. So that's a basic introduction. Any questions at this point about what I've kind of brought in here as introduction? Okay, good. So moving on, I want to remind you that the city recently adopted a housing action plan. This happened in 2023, so it's really recent. Through that project, you folks reviewed the community's housing needs, evaluated the existing policies, and you summarized feedback that you received to understand those gaps and solutions. So here's some of the recommendations that are in the housing action plan. I won't read through that, but the idea is that it really set the stage for a lot of the actions the city can do. So we've tried to incorporate a lot of the information that was in there where it fits in the comprehensive plan. It is still its own standalone document in terms of what it does for the city, setting up kind of more tactical measures or different ways to do say partnerships, things like that. So it should definitely align, but it doesn't need to repeat everything that the housing action plan says, looking at the housing element specifically. I also wanted to emphasize that for the housing action plan, there really was an extensive public engagement process, and the council looked at a number of options for addressing housing challenges and issues. All of this is going to fold into this comprehensive plan update, especially since it was so recent. We were really careful because we didn't want to have survey fatigue. So when we came out and we were asking for input on the comprehensive plan, we were really careful to say, okay, we're asking questions about parks, trails, open space. And separately, we've already asked some questions recently about housing, which doesn't mean that we weren't listening to any more feedback about housing, but we just wanted to say, hey, we've heard that and it will still be used in this process. So just wanted to highlight that to make it clear. All right, and now I'm going to move into some information that you would have read going through the packet in terms of population information, information on your housing stock, and so forth. So the existing comprehensive plan has the data that was available and as it was assembled back in, I think it was 2017 or so. And now, you know, there's obviously been changes in the city. The city has really had some rapid growth. So it's interesting to now take a view of what your current conditions are. For population growth, I wanted to highlight that it's been a real steady climb year after year. The Duval population is shown in the bars there. And what we're also showing is the Duval annual growth rate and the King County annual growth rate. Those kind of skip up and down, but it's always been positive growth rate. Except for one, well, I guess that's not quite true. There's some, well, it's always been a positive growth rate, but sometimes the growth rate has decreased from one year to the next. The other thing I wanted to mention here, Duval overall is growing at a faster rate than King County on the whole. And it has a higher average annual growth rate. If we look back this 23-year time frame, we see that the annual growth rate for Duval is 2.7% per year, whereas the county is 1.3%. So we're outpacing the growth countywide. So just wanted to put that out so you would understand that. Next slide, please. Here's some of our key findings, if you will, and things that we've observed in terms of demographic shifts over time. So Duval still is a small town, relatively sense, but over the past 2 years, you have nearly doubled in size. So that's dramatic change. Duval has a much higher share of children in households as compared to King County overall. And you also have a higher kind of incidence of adults aged between 35 and 64. So that's interesting. Your city is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. The persons of color share was about 8% of the population back in 2012. And this grew to 27% in 2022. So that's a big demographic shift. Your average household size is higher than King County overall. This kind of reflects that, you know, there's a lot of households that are maybe larger families compared to the average in the county. And this one's remarkable. Duval has a very high rate of homeownership. I mean, you know, this is an affluent community. Fewer than 10% of the residents are living in rentals. There's a lot of homeownership here. And most of the city's housing stock is single family homes, 86%. And that's sort of been the standard of how development's been done for the most part over the decades. Any questions on this or observations? Thank you. All right, just to dive a little deeper into race and ethnicity changes, I just wanted to show these breakdowns here. Might be a little hard to read some of these categories, so I'll just announce them very quickly. But the first band is persons who are white alone, no other race. The next band is Black. And then the next band, which hardly is represented here, is American Indian and Alaska Native alone. The next category, which you do have more of a representation of, is Asian alone. And then from there, you have the Native, Hawaiian, and other Pacific Islander alone. And then the category some other race alone, 2 or more races, and then Hispanic. And again, that's where we find a swing up. These categories are consistent with census data. So just wanted to put that out there. And what we're showing here is a comparison of King County compared to Duval and the percentages. And then we're also comparing it for the different years. So we looked at 2012 and 2022. So pretty remarkable shifts and changes over a 10-year time period. Also, I wanted to highlight that the percentage of residents here in Duval who were born outside of the United States has grown. It was 8%, and now that share of population is 18%. So that's pretty significant. And also the share of residents who speak a language other than English at home has risen. It's increased from 10% to 18% of the population over the same time period. And this is likely due to increases in residents who speak Indo-European languages other than Spanish. Okay, next slide. All right, rising housing costs. I could show you all sorts of graphs and charts that would horrify you, but we know that housing has really gone up. We know that housing has outpaced income and things like that. So, you know, like I said, we could dive into this issue really deeply, but just for now, I wanted to provide these 2 graphs, which I think really drive a lot of information, drive us to understand a lot of the information that we've gathered here. So the top graph on the right-hand side is average monthly rent. The one on the bottom right-hand side is the median home sales price. Duval is the orange line, and then comparable cities that we looked at, Monroe, North Bend, Redmond, Snohomish, Snoqualmie, and Woodinville are shown in different colors there. So Duval is notable for having a very, very high average monthly rent and being much further above other cities in comparison. Now, when we look at the median sales price, it's actually more of a midpoint. So that's kind of interesting that we find that here with the situation. Duval does, as I mentioned before, have kind of a high median household income. We would even say it's an extremely high median household income. The median household income is roughly $169,000 a year. That is $52,000 higher than the county's median household income. Again, that's not average, that's the median, but high numbers for sure. You can also see the little bullet points here about housing prices changing. The median home price has tripled in a 10-year period. It's crazy. Okay, next slide. This goes a little deeper into talking about housing affordability and how it differs by income. What we have found, and the state has really put a lot of information out about this, there is an insufficient housing supply across the state that cannot meet the current rising demand. This means that rent prices in the state have significantly increased and wages have only grown modestly during that time period. As of March 2024, there is a statewide shortage of 171,000 rental homes that are affordable to renters with extremely low incomes. So it just gives you kind of a measure of how severe this is. I can give you some more statistics too about affordability with HUD, but what I like about this graphic here is that it shows, you know, kind of where you are on the continuum of where your household earning is, and you'll see these are indexed according to the percentage of the median family income. It shows what you can afford in terms of home prices. And so if all the home prices are on the right-hand side or hitting that, you know, higher number or even beyond, that means that it's not affordable to a lot of common families. And then they've also placed at the bottom here, this graphic is by Echo Northwest, where different professionals earn. And I did want to emphasize that's for single income households. So if you've got dual earners in a household, then your affordability level changes. But I think this is just fascinating to kind of look at these different steps. The other thing I would mention is that this is based on sort of the standards in industry about affordability based on HUD incomes and the standard of, you know, how much of a percentage of a person's income should be going to housing. So it's kind of just based on that kind of paradigm that we use. Any questions on that one? Okay. As I mentioned before, there are some targets that we need to meet. Right here, this is going to show you what we need throughout the whole state of Washington, and then I'll show you what Duval's share looks like. So future housing needs are broken down by this area, median income, different groups. So if you earn 100% of the area median income, that means that half the people earn less than you and half the people earn more than you. And so remember, that's the standard that we're looking at. This is showing these different income bands, 0 to 30% within permanent supportive housing, 0 to 30% that's non-permanent supportive housing, and then goes further on, 30 to 50%, 50 to 80%. Again, everything's benchmarked by AMI. And we do that because it changes every year. But it shows you what the need is in terms of actual real numbers. In total, in the state of Washington, 1.1 million new homes will be needed in the next 20 years. That's a lot to produce. In addition, there will also need to be 91,357 emergency housing beds or temporary housing made available to accommodate the public. So knowing that this is what we're starting from statewide, they've divided out to communities.
Just a general question on the 1.1 million. Does that map to any particular size in terms of number of bedrooms, number of occupants? Is it, you know, an aggregate number? Because obviously that the size of that structure, what's built, the cost of that structure could vary widely based on community.
Yeah, and that has been baked in the analysis. So they did look at what housing types and availability and things like that. Now, there's a difference between what people strictly need to get by and then consumer preferences. So some people are in houses that have, you know, maybe more bedrooms than they typically need, or fewer bedrooms that they really could use. But, you know, we're looking at things on the whole, kind of in that lens of how to assess the housing needs.
And you know, that helps because I know Seattle has, you know, 1-bedroom apartments that are going for crazy rates, but then we also, you know, older houses that have more bedrooms, and then obviously new construction's always going to run higher. And
when we move neighborhood to neighborhood, we're going to find, you know, it's not always apples to apples, certainly, and throughout different parts of King County and different parts of the state. So sometimes it's really hard to kind of generalize, but this is supposed to give you just a generalized sense of where we need to be. Now, this graphic is from the State Department of Commerce. On the left-hand side, what they're saying is, in general, the way that we can best meet the needs of the folks that are at the lower income spectrum is to provide more apartments. We've been underbuilding apartments. We need more multifamily housing. Beyond that, people who are maybe in a later stage of life, maybe they have more earning power, maybe we need more multiplex type structures. So something like a duplex or sixplex. So not exactly an apartment, not exactly a single family detached home, but something in between. A lot of times that's called an housing. And then on the right-hand side, the predominant building that we've seen in the suburbs for the decades, over the decades, has been single-family housing. Really, that's mostly attainable by people who are at the higher ends of the spectrum. There are exceptions, of course. There are some really high-end multifamily apartments and multiplexes being built in Duval and throughout King County. So there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. And I think certainly anything that's new is typically going to command higher prices, you know, built to higher energy standards, built with newer materials, all of those types of things. But on the whole, this kind of gives you an idea of the framework that we're trying to plan under. If I left anything out, anyone add? Okay. Okay. We'll go to the next slide. This is a graphic that we've created for Duval to show what is our particular housing target and gap. Now, this is just what it's called, a target, right? This is what we are planning for. And this has been passed down to Duval from the countywide planning policy. So there was a framework put together by the state legislature of how to look at these different income bands. And this is a different way that we're planning now with this periodic update. We did, before we said, you know, cities need to make sure that there is space for affordable housing. It was just kind of, yep, we got that. But now they need us to go through and actually show it and do the math. So I'll explain a little bit more about how that's done. It's tricky. Do you have a question?
Yeah, one thing I just looking at this, I'm thinking the targets were, I think starting in 2019 was the baseline, and we've built a lot since then. And majority multiplex, some single family unit. I would say almost every single one of them was more than 120% AMI.
Yeah.
And so,
You're
I mean, we've already done it.
Yeah. Yeah, you are
So
We're gonna get there because that's been honestly our biggest struggle and why it's taken us a little bit longer. We're still working on our housing capacity because we may not be able to get to where the expectation is. So we're just trying to shuffle the deck and kind of look at everything.
I think we've used up probably 890 with what we built and what's in our pipeline.
We're getting closer, yes.
Yeah.
And I'll just be honest, what's frustrating is the state solution is you just build apartments, like you build, and they say high density. Well, guess what? Duval does not have high density in the terms of King County and the state of Washington guidelines. We feel like we're building higher density, but really that's low to mid. And so we're gonna go through and tell our story, talk about our story, but we're probably still gonna have to make some adjustments for affordable housing under the 120%.
And you brought up a good point, because a lot of the housing targets is not set out from this year and 20 years moving forward. We're actually basing that back in 2018. And that's because that's the point in time at which the urban growth report was put out by King County, looking at the assessment. I see a lot of head nods, you're familiar. That's great. So yes, 890 new homes need to be built between 2018 and 2044. That would mean 32 units per year. You are currently adding more like 53 units per year. So you're outpacing what you are required to do. However, it's not level, right? It's very top heavy in terms of income. So what we will be doing is recognizing, okay, what's been built in the interim? What do we still have in the pipeline? And what do we still need to supplement that 20 years worth of growth? Knowing what we know about what's been built out, but then not making assumptions beyond what could be built in terms of capacity for the zoning that remains available or underutilized.
And we'll look at what's in the pipeline too, or that already received, you know.
Yes.
Yeah, we're doing that work. I think our greatest concern internally is that we're supposed to also show the affordable housing units, and that is likely going to be more than what we have left in our pipeline. And we've talked a little bit about this, but now it's definitely coming to front and center. And it was hard because the legislature last year, that's when they said, okay, cities, you are going to be required to show us your work on this. But it wasn't part of that conversation when we did our targets a couple of years ago, because we do targets usually a couple of years before we do the comp plan. So it just makes it really challenging for cities, and we're obviously not the only ones struggling with this. And so there is likely going to be this reconciliation process that we might have to go through next year with the county and the Puget Sound Regional Council. So, and we'll talk more about that, because I know that that's a lot of words, but we just want to kind of start having that conversation.
Yeah. Two other things I want to emphasize on the slide. One is that, and this is a big assumption, there's an assumption baked in that a lot of this housing that's on the lower spectrum, the 0 to 30% AMI, a lot of that's going to need to be subsidized to make it actually work. I mean, these projects wouldn't pencil for a developer, so it's going to require intervention beyond what the market forces are. And so we need to be real honest about that. And then the other thing that's in play is that jurisdictions are required to update your development regulations with respect to what they're calling step housing. So it's emergency shelters, that's the S. T is for transitional housing, E is for emergency housing, and P is permanent supportive housing. So you cannot say no to these things, right? It's every city has their own fair share that they need to accommodate, and that's part of the reason why they've done this so granular, where they have these housing targets, is to make sure that certain cities aren't overburdened or bearing more than their fair share of doing certain things. So that's part of the goal there, is to make sure everybody's pitching in.
And that 170 is for Duval?
Yes, over 20 years, by the time we're done and building out in 2044, according to this plan, there would need to be 170 emergency housing beds. So right now you have a handful, but you don't have anywhere near that number. My hope is that that number will go down. Honestly, I hope that we don't have to be building as much as the state says we do of emergency housing beds, but this is where they've come out right now with their analysis and the state of where we are just with respect to the housing crunch. Hopefully we can quickly have a rebound and get past this point where we have such a restriction on supply demand and all these other forces that are making things really difficult.
Just super quick feedback. The 0 to 30%, one thing, I talked to one of the agencies that does provide some of the housing for the lower end, and it's a real struggle about the access to jobs and the access to transit out here. So I don't know necessarily if this is even the appropriate place for those to be successful, because they're a long ways from doctor's offices, they're a long way from services, they're, like I said, no transit, and even the job situation is not, necessarily compatible with. So I think that also has to be discussed, that may not be reasonable.
So that's what, remember I used the word reconciliation. So when the state gives numbers, right, it's like from 150,000 feet, right? And then PSRC takes it, and then King County takes it, and then we kind of get the number. And we obviously know that we don't have wraparound services, we don't have transit. We're, a small community, like you said, we don't yet have like a shelter. We don't have, all the medical care, which is kind of those wraparound and social, services in general. And so we'll go to the county and tell our story. And then it's likely that we'll have to go through a reconciliation process to drop off, especially like, that 30% and under, and take a smaller piece of that number by telling our story and giving local context. So we're working through that right now. None of us anticipated having to do this last year because this came at us last year. So we weren't aware or focused in this direction. So we're trying to handle as much of it as we can in this comp plan process. We're going to be a little bit late in approval. We've already had conversations with Thomas. We also have to go through King County, which is taking about 5 months to review everybody's information and documentation. We'll get a nice letter from them that'll probably give us, 4 or 5 pages of comments, and then we'll finish the process at a city level, and then we'll likely have to go back and do, like I said, reconciliation with agencies again. So we're going to be doing as much work as we can for this cycle, and know that we're going to go back and have to do some additional work.
I haven't heard someone describe it as, with all of these housing reforms that took place in the last 2 years at the legislative level, it's kind of like before we were planning under GMA 1.0, and now we're in GMA 2.0, the Growth Management Act. I mean, it's that different in terms of transformation. And Mar's exactly right. All of that sort of hit midstream. And things were already kind of underway and everything. It wouldn't have just been great information to have when you were working on your housing action plan, for example. It's just, timing has been unfortunate with some of this. But we're moving forward. We're doing the best that we can with the information we're given and working through it. You had a question?
Yeah, and I did, and I don't want to go too far in the weeds because I know this isn't a review, but one of the things that came up when Amy and I were at a sort of offsite for Steely, in talking to some other cities, similar challenges, and one of the discussions was around ADUs, which I know we've talked about in here. It's not a specific bucket up here, and they've taken some really creative approaches, like pre-approved designs, that are packaged, and they have accelerated hookups. So there's a lot of pre-design work that is essentially subsidizing construction without the subsidy. It's basically you're streamlining the process. They've already gone through permit review, their pre-approved design. Without going too deep, like where does that fit in? Because that addresses a number of things: seniors, temporary housing, the worker piece. I know we have some different opinions within sort of council and planning, but it was an innovative approach because it defined some of the design and addressed some of the potential Wild West, approach. There was some framework around it, and the feedback, at least from the cities have done it, was net positive. So I was just curious where that fit into this particular view.
I can you start, and then I'll finish because I'm going to talk about a little bit about the ADUs.
ADUs definitely have a place in terms of meeting some of these questions and objectives. One thing that's interesting about the state is that a lot of cities right now are required to amend their development regulations to bring in what's called the middle housing. Let's talk about, make sure that you have a certain number of units that you can accommodate that is in that category where you predominantly already permit single family housing. That being said, they don't consider ADUs middle housing. They've accepted it. And the reason I think is because it's few and far between where you can actually do it. And a lot of them, once they're actually built out, they're coming in pretty high value. Yeah. Yeah. So it is a great solution to a lot of these. There's a lot of problems out there, and it's a great solution to some of those. It's a part of the whole toolbox of what we're doing right now, and we're doing a lot of different.
Yeah, that's great, because it addressed also the affordability of the people already living in the houses too, because it was also an income stream. So it sort of touched two ends of the equation. So
I'm going to add a little bit onto that, because internally we have to actually update our ADU policy by the middle of next year to be compliant. And so under new state legislation, we'll allow 2 ADUs per parcel. There'll still have to be things that are met, but parking is going to be an issue where the state has basically said you aren't required to have parking for future ADUs. So there's some things that we're going to have to navigate, and it's kind of like I'll call it choose 3 of 5. We're gonna have to like go through this exercise, but thinking about those kind of pre-approved stock ADUs, we would really like to do that, but it's not inexpensive because we have to pick up a plan or create one with an architect and engineer and then have them ready. And then know we might have to update them again when the building code changes. Cause I was last year when I was at the planning directors conference, we actually talked about ADUs and there's like it's about a handful of cities in the state that have that program, but they invested a couple $100,000 in doing that program and buying kind of those stock plans. And so I think what we would want to look for is like, are there already ADUs out there that are approvable? Or look at creating maybe 2 here with a couple of elevations and seeing if we can do something economically. So stay tuned. We're in budget, but I have to be cautious, you know, as well about like how much money we would be spending to do that. It might be where we have to take the first step, which is create the policy, and then in a couple of years come back and say, okay, can we create some models for people to pick up?
Thank you.
All right, so the next slide, I just wanted to, you don't mind advancing it, or I just wanted to talk about whether or not the city can sort of, the next one please, really do affordable housing. How do we do it? What are the do's and don'ts that we have here? So as a reminder, and I kind of started out with this, the city does not build housing. Like that is not under the charter of the city council to give people housing. But the city does regulate housing. And so we have a responsibility here and we need to be very careful in how we are moving forward with that. So in terms of what we can do for affordable housing, we can remove regulatory barriers that are preventing opportunities in the marketplace for affordable housing to be built. We can do things like partnerships and also development agreements, pre-annexation agreements with covenants. Some of these tools we've already been using. Balancing this where we can't, or it's a don't, you don't infringe upon private property rights and you don't create zoning or other mechanisms that could impede the market. So it's a balancing act, to put it simply. The next few slides I'm going to move through fairly quickly, but I just wanted to spend a little bit of time to talk about the emergency shelters, transitional housing, emergency housing, and permanent supportive housing, because that's a complex issue. But the state has sort of put some information together, so I just took it and put it in this couple of slides here. This is from Washington Department of Commerce State of the Practice Report that just came out last month. So these are some of the barriers that prevent those housing types. You can see probably pulled out of a lot of this: rising cost of land, high permit fees, the NIMBY attitudes, neighborhood covenants and restrictions. Neighborhood covenants and restrictions may actually preempt some of this ADU development from occurring, right? The city might say, yeah, we're allowing ADUs in all these different zoning districts, and yet there might be these other things that are going to provide barriers. So these are just things to be aware of. And some of these things the city has their finger on, and other things are totally not, nothing we can do about, like rising cost of labor and materials. Okay, and then the next slide. This is just to talk for a minute about local regulations and requirements that end up being barriers sometimes. So if the city were to have unclear development regulations or regulations that are inconsistent with state and federal laws, like fair housing laws. So we don't know of any issues like that, but that's one thing that the state is saying, hey, you should do kind of an audit and make sure that you are compliant with these things. If you have requirements for shelters, transitional housing, emergency housing that are different than what you require for other housing development, that's frowned upon too. You should be having equal requirements regardless of what the housing is for. Another barrier potentially is conditional use permits or design review requirements, and so on and so forth. So some of these things are what cities are being asked to look at if they can. Some cities are trying to roll back their parking requirements, for example, because that might be a barrier to affordable housing. And then the last slide, This is more of the same, but also if you have requirements about, hey, if you're gonna build a shelter, you have to have coordination with local police and fire departments, or if you have arbitrary limits on how it operates, things like that. These are some of the things that cities want to do a lot of times. They want to have some control over these things, but the state is saying, hey, you know, you should not actually be in this business of limiting it if you can. Okay, so the next slide then. Again, that was just guidance from Commerce. I just wanted to kind of brief that out. Now I'm going to move into the proposed goal and policy changes. So you'll remember at the beginning of the presentation, I kind of showed you some of the basics, the things that we already have in the comprehensive plan. Now I'm going to roll in and show you some of the things that we're proposing to tune up or change. And again, if you read through the document, you'll see that these items are shown in track changes. So it's hopefully very transparent. You can see all this. Okay, so this first one now. Well, let me tell you this. There are 7 housing goals involved. The 7th one is proposed to be new. And in some cases, I'm going to show you specific word changes, and then others, I'm just going to summarize it for you so that I'm kind of giving you I think the best approach here. So we're not here all night. Goal 1 is to preserve, maintain, and enhance existing housing and residential neighborhoods. So again, that's an existing goal. When we look into policy H1.1, it says to implement site building and landscape design standards for new development within the existing neighborhoods, and it says to preserve the established neighborhood character. And we're actually saying we should strike that part where it says to preserve the established neighborhood character, to instead say something a little more inclusive or wide-ranging. Instead, it would say something like that blends in and enhances existing neighborhoods without implementing regulatory barriers for the development of diverse housing types. So again, it's kind of a course correction for the city. And again, this is your guiding policy that would be implemented through your development regulations and other things that you're doing.
I'm going to stop it because this could feel challenging because we have infill development or areas that we might develop in the future that are adjacent to a neighborhood that may have developed, 10 years ago or 20 years ago and be on much larger lots. And so we've definitely already experienced kind of that issue with like clearing and grading and walls and the height of houses when you then have walls. And so we really have to go back and retool like our landscape standards, our design guidelines. The challenge is going to be is that we're still trying to create areas for the housing units and not have as many regulatory barriers. It's going to be a balancing act, and I'm not exactly sure how we're going to work it out. We're probably going to have to go through some visual exercises as we update those standards so that we all see what it's going to look or what it can look like and do a couple of study areas. As Larissa and I and Troy and Steve, our community development team, we've been here for in general quite a while, and we find the most difficult projects, the ones that are developing out now, not just because of density, but because there's like a ton of grade. There might be, we're trying to save trees, and we have, more open space, like we have more standards than we did pre-GMA or even like 20 years ago, where we're just trying to balance all of these needs and wants of our community, but also bringing in housing that does blend in and enhance, that's compatible. And I think it's going to be really difficult with what land we have left.
And just before we move on, if you just think of the phrase to preserve the established neighborhood character, and I put that in red because that's the part we're recommending you trim out, that can really be used by the NIMBY crowd, right? The people who are like, no, your comprehensive plan says we need to preserve the existing neighborhood character. That means Duval shouldn't change. And we need to shift from that because we know that the community needs to grow. We know that these, there's some changes that need to occur. They need to be done the right way. But that's a really high bar to preserve, you know, existing neighborhood character and something that can kind of be used to prevent progress, I would say. And so that's kind of the idea, is trying to remove this language that can be used as a barrier. The next slide. Moving on to goal 2. And again, I'm just showing you snippets where we're changing something. Site and building design standards promote high quality design and neighborhood character in new residential subdivisions and new multifamily structures. We just want to pick this policy that talks about your standards and talks about variety and quality design and being consistent, and instead put in that addition supporting the attainment of affordable housing. So just kind of threading that in. So that's a theme. Okay. Next slide, and I will tell you, we're about 10 of these slides to go over. Goal H3, this is where we have a goal about innovative and creative uses of land. It says it enables a variety of housing types to accommodate changing design technologies, demands, preferences, and so forth. In general, we have some policies under there, the ones that are kind of newish or have been changed up. We really want to emphasize that we're allowing for various housing types. We're emphasizing that we want to evaluate cottage housing, duplexes, and revise your code to allow to include standards for these. We know that the state's requiring the city to allow 2 ADUs per lot, so put that in as policy, and that's something that can be implemented in your code. And finally, create incentives for single-story houses for housing for aging adults. Something we heard repeated again and again with public engagement we did. It's hard to find anything being built in Duval right now that's not on multiple levels. Okay. Continuing on that, there are 2 new proposed policies. The first is to strive to create mixed income neighborhoods. You want to integrate your affordable housing with your market rate housing and avoid concentrations of anything that's below market rate. And I know certainly the county will be looking for this type of policy in your comprehensive plan, because that's something that they've set out in their countywide planning policies that they want the cities to be sure they're doing. So the idea is not to concentrate or put all of your low-income housing one side of town. The next policy is to update your regs and procedures to provide a high degree of certainty and predictability to applicants. So developers always want to know as much about what to expect at the beginning rather than surprises. I mean, every day is money. And so anything that we can do to prevent time delays, make sure your permit processing machine is well oiled and humming along well, that is going to be really good for developers. And that's going to help alleviate any of the potential problems that can happen that prevent the development from occurring. So we want to make sure we do that.
Just add, we're like a team. And Naomi, don't forget you're part of the team too. I know you're back there. We are actually required by next year to update our 1408, our permit processing section. So the first week in September, we're already getting too far out. We'll actually start having that conversation in concept. We're going to start drafting the policies, but the state is requiring new timelines for review that come with a punitive money back approach if we don't process them in a certain amount of time. But they're also taking away our local ability to run design review through our planning commission and hearing examiner moving forward for residential. And so those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to come back and update. So there's going to be a lot of items that are going to be administrative because of the changes that we're seeing at the legislative level. And so this somewhat goes into that housing goal.
Yeah, and that's not to say that you can't have design standards, but they need to be black and white and really easy to apply. Not no head scratching by a planning commission deciding, you know, what do we think? It's gonna be kind of a different approach. All right, and I have one more to cut under goal H3. That is to review and consider revising your Duval Municipal Code to allow a broader diversity of small housing options. This could be single room occupancy, shared housing, co-living, co-housing, and consider or review and consider revising that you would allow SROs in all multifamily and mixed use residential zones. So that would definitely be new, and it's not a have to, but it's something that the city can look at, you know, when the time comes to see if there's something you want to accommodate. Okay, and then next slide. Thank you. Goal H4 is about affordable housing for low income and moderate income and extremely low income. Like to list it all out now. So we're talking about expanding your first policy, and there's where it kind of goes through kind of, here's what we can do. We can have a comprehensive strategy. We would look at funding options like housing trust funds, surplus property, different innovative approaches like that, while prioritizing the use of local and regional resources for income restricted housing, and implement those strategies with partners like King County to provide those low and moderate income housing, permanent supportive housing, and emergency housing, consistent with countywide affordable housing needs and the countywide planning policies. One thing I want to emphasize here is that the city of Duval is not given CDBG funds from HUD on an annual basis. The community development block grant money, like you don't have a flow of that. You're not an entitlement community. You can do those programs in partnership. But that's one of the struggles of being a small city. Like, how are we supposed to do all these programs if we don't have, you know, this guaranteed funding or these different programs available? So we really do want to point to what you can do, and that's partner and line up with those other programs.
And ARCH is another one of those organizations. So some cities actually pay into ARCH to help create those units, not necessarily just in the city, but in other jurisdictions where they are closer to the amenities that are needed for supportive housing.
Since you mentioned ARCH, can I ask a question about that? I talked to him once about having ARCH here, and I was told that it was like difficult to work with the program. But I have a friend who just applied for an ARCH home at Big Rock. So I'm wondering.
It's through an interlocal, right?
So yes.
Oh, okay.
So we have an interlocal agreement with ARCH.
Okay.
For, I want to say about 26 units. We do not pay into their program. We only contract out for them to manage our affordable housing units out at Toll Brothers. So we have a partial relationship with them.
Okay.
They're not right now accepting new cities. The program is housed out actually inside the city of Bellevue City Hall. So all of the staff of ARCH are actually employees of the city. And, you know, at some point, we're hoping that they open their door back up and their boundaries and start to maybe take in some more communities. I think it's going to be important for some of our valley communities to have that type of partnership.
Yeah.
But we do have one. It's just for sale units, and it's limited to just the Toll Brothers project at this point.
Okay.
That's all they would do.
Okay. All right. I think it's a good addition. So
yeah,
I'd like to see more of that.
And thank you for that. So cue this up quickly for the next slide. Where I've generalized some of the policies that we're proposing that would be new, but one is to evaluate potential changes to the ARCH agreement, potentially become a member community. Explore the possibility of establishing a home repair program. A lot of the bigger cities do things like that. Maybe there's a way to do it in the future in Duval or to partner for it. The next one is to develop strategies to reduce cost barriers. It's kind of a real general one. And then promote homeownership opportunities for moderate and low-income households by allowing for a variety of housing types, densities, and also community land trust arrangements. One thing that people talk a lot is the housing ladder. You know, when you're kind of new in a career or just starting out, you know, you have different housing preferences and abilities, you know, what you have access to. And that changes as you go on in life, and that might look like family, that might look like career changes, things like that. And then once you become an older adult, once again, your housing needs change. So the more that we can provide different options in the community, the better to accommodate people at all those different stages, and to make sure that you can kind of keep people in town. They don't have to leave town looking for something else. Okay. Goal H4 continued. Again, partnerships, you're going to just see a whole lot of that discussed. Explore ways to create and preserve income restricted units. So that's meaning units that have been set aside for people who qualify based on their income not being above a certain ceiling. Analyze the use of a ground lease program for underutilized publicly owned land. That may not be something that's feasible now, but maybe it can be monitored for the future. And then there could be a policy to consider allowing tiny homes. I would probably want to look back to see how that was phrased exactly, because I don't remember it right now, but that's something to consider. Okay. Now these are some new ones we want to revise. After we review the affordable housing definitions in the Duval Municipal Code, that is something that needs to be done, including the definitions for different income levels and workforce housing. So Laura was talking about how there are different definitions that are kind of used locally when we're talking about density, and how it doesn't always line up with what King County considers to be, say, high density or moderate density. Same thing goes for affordable housing. We want to make sure we're kind of using the same language and the same terms that other programs are doing as much as possible. They don't always line up, but as much as we can like not create our own set of definitions, I think you'd be well served. So I would replace going with the King County countywide planning policy definitions. And we did provide that for you in your packet. So if you look through it, be like, okay, what's all this? What do these terms mean? And hopefully we can help guide you through all the alphabet soup too, the different acronyms. Next, identify actions that will increase the rental housing options. Again, we have a shout out for the Arch. And then develop and implement ordinance requiring a notice for intent to sale for multifamily residential development. So if a landlord's like, hey, I'm out of this game, I'm not gonna keep this building, there would be a 30-day or 60-day window, something like that, where the community members will know about it, so that you're not maybe if there's something locally that can be done about it, or a local owner that has local person has interest, you keep that local ownership rather than a potential new buyer coming.
I was just going to add, so a good example of this was the co-op housing development just down the hill from us. The previous owner was going to sell that, and they honestly came in pretty panicked. And so internally we did some research, found them some information, connected them with a nonprofit that goes through and helps them purchase it and create a co-op so that they could purchase the land there. And so that really saved that particular development. And that is one of our more affordable housing areas, right? So we felt really lucky that, that somebody came, we asked questions, and we got people connected. We obviously did some support writing and helped them through the process. Sorry, hosted meetings, those types of things. But we do have other manufactured home communities that, could be at threat, moving forward if somebody chose to sell, those particular areas, and then do, what other development under that zoning. Maybe a more recent example of what could potentially happen is, Duval Village is fee in lots, so they're single lots, but somebody came in and purchased everything, and then it's a rental. But they could sell each unit off over time. That's 99 of our rental units, which is a large percentage of our overall rental.
Gotcha. I feel like I'm going a little long, so I'm gonna try to pick up the pace, but I don't want to skip over anything that's important either, so thank you for bearing with me here. Still under the umbrella of goal H4, we were proposing that you have this policy to explore measures to preserve manufactured housing, such as through a manufactured housing preservation program, kind of the same thing that you just led into. And then support the establishment of incentives for first-time home buyers, including young adults and those within the local workforce. We think that's really important these days. You need workforce housing here. And explore partnership opportunities. And then we're gonna go to goal 5. So this is something we're suggesting you change up just a little bit. Support improved access to permanent and temporary housing for residents with disabilities, healthcare needs, or other special needs. This is certainly another area where we need to be beefing up our efforts a little bit in order to comply with the countywide planning policies. So we want to add in the phrase about permanent supportive housing. We list out the development of special needs housing. And we also want to add in a phrase that says allow permanent supportive housing in residential and mixed use zones with appropriate infrastructure and in locations near needed services. Not really hits on what I was talking about a minute ago, where yeah, for permanent supportive housing, you at least want to be able to walk to bus stop if you can. You know, you want to be able to look at those types of things that make it really work for people. Yes.
This doesn't specifically say elderly senior, but it seems like all those things would fit with that population. Is that intended to address senior elderly?
Yes, there is already some language in your plan that addresses that. And then the next slide, I actually do have something that again elevates that topic beyond what you already have, and that's to provide increased awareness of regional services for seniors and examine incentives to support accessible design such as visitability, which is a new term to me, but it's defined in there, and universal design standards. So yeah, you already have policies in place that say you want to work with senior housing. This is one way to kind of step it up. Okay. And now goal 6, this is, well, we're getting there. Okay, so this one says pedestrians killed mixed use development fills a unique and attractive niche in Duval's overall housing mix. Only some minor rewording is proposed, so move on from that very quickly. Don't need to spend any time on that. Goal 7 is all new. This is where we would say that the city wants to achieve a mix of housing types to meet the needs of diverse households at all income levels. I mean, that's sort of already there, but we want to be just that much more definitive and make it its own standalone goal because of how important it is. So some new policies, let's see, I have 3 in all that I wanted to go over. This first one is to review your regulations so that you can support diverse middle housing. And it would be a job to do at some point, but you should review the city's use tables in the code to identify opportunities to expand the diversity of housing choices, including all of those middle housing developments. Even though you're not required to, it's probably still a good idea to go through that exercise. And look at other regulatory changes that were described in your housing action plan. And what I love about this is that even though you're not required to comply with the middle housing bill and the trailer bill that came about with it, just because of your location and the fact that you're not near things like high capacity transit, you actually did get kind of a pass on that one. But what's been great about it is there's some guidance that's come out where cities can look at their development regulations and kind of compare them against some standards that the state has said these are best practices, and see like how good are we doing? Like, are we allowing enough building height to get, you know, diverse housing types? Are our setbacks, you know, a little too extreme? Can we make some changes? So that could be an opportunity in the future. And then 7.2 would read allow greater diversity and range of housing by location, tenure, size, amenities, and so forth, to ensure residents of all stages of life have housing opportunities. And then develop a monitoring program getting guidance from King County and Puget Sound Regional Council to track your local housing target and allocations and other key metrics useful. You have to do this anyways.
Yes, I was just gonna say, it's not because I want to, we have to actually do this.
Every 5 years.
You know, in your earlier stats you provided, you showed sort of a shift in demographics and ethnicity and sort of, I was curious, I didn't see specifically called out, but it seems to flow through a lot of this is multi-generational families. You get families where there's, you know, a larger family, they might have grandparents and younger children. Is that sort of captured through a lot of the diversity? It's not specifically called out, but that's oftentimes comes with that shift in demographics and particularly from folks outside of the US.
I think a lot of that tends to be more like anecdotal data because it's hard to drill it down with census because I don't think we ask exactly, like, we would ask how many people are in the household and what language do you speak? And there's certain questions they ask and then there's other questions they don't ask. But I will tell you the average household size has increased. And so that's an indicator, I think, of, you know, likely more generational.
And you touched on occupancy a little bit as well in terms of there's a different couple columns. I was just curious if that came up at all in your analysis.
Yeah, and then I would have to look back again at the housing action plan to see, I think there's probably a kind of qualitative description.
The hard thing is like, we just don't have access to some data because of either we don't have access to it or it's not there. And so like the census only has certain questions and we would hope that maybe moving forward, because it's just not Washington in a housing crisis, it's really across the nation, is that maybe they'll create a couple of new questions to find out, you know, do you have, you know, something that says, you know, do you have other family members living with you that are not your, you know, essentially.
And just a sort of anecdotal, I mean, I see that sort of like who's walking the dogs. A lot of times you just, you know, it's observational in terms of folks and families and the mix has changed. And I think ultimately it comes down to the diversity of housing stock and the offers versus a specific call out. But I just, you know, have noticed that as that's also, you know, part of the character of the change. You see larger families or babies with grandparents, or, you know, which is a shift from some of the younger families we have in fact.
And we definitely see that out in the field, you know, when we're doing development activities where we're seeing a lot more what I call grandparents out in the field with the, you know, the kids or the parks. And it's that generational housing. And a lot of times when we see some of the larger housing units, you know, there's options for like a 5th bedroom, and then a lot of them are taking advantage of that extra bedroom or that extra shower and stuff too.
Yeah, so
And also,
on that same note, in the development community, there's in some states they do a lot of building what's called a next gen home. So it's a home essentially built with an ADU in it. But the ADU is more kind of interconnected with the house, you know, so the grandparents can go through a door and walk into the main house, but then also can have their own private functional space all within the same home, so.
And we're seeing some national home builders now, not in Duval yet, but that are actually doing construction now of what Troy's talking about, which was a home with an ADU. And so I think it's just a matter of time before we start to see that. And we already allow that, so it'll complement it well together. So you can come in now with an ADU permit, a house permit, and actually create an ADU as well, either attached or attached or detached.
so we're talking maybe multiple kitchens, multiple laundry facilities, things like that in the home. Yeah. You can also look at real estate listings. You know, and I've noticed that I think even when you look on Zillow now, you can check a box for, you know, you're looking for a house that has an ADU or has an additional unit available to it. So yeah, it's definitely a shift.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have one last slide, which is next steps. So I can't ask the second question. But
or the first one, because
for the first one. Yeah.
Gathering.
So this was a gathering, and I really appreciate you listening to all the information and letting me distill kind of what we presented. Just so you know, we do need to prepare a document that will go to the Affordable Housing Committee, and they are staffed up at King County. So staff looks at different cities' housing elements as they come in. and they look at the land use maps too. They do an analysis and then they bring it to a subgroup at King County that looks at these things and provides official comments. This is another one of those new processes that kicked in after we had started everything. And it's been a little interesting to see how it all works. But I am working on a couple of different comprehensive plan updates, so I've been able to benefit from seeing kind of how the process works. In any event, we need to decide at some point when we're ready to send this over and onward to that review group and then get the comments back. So timing is going to be really important. I can tell you that we won't be ready after tonight to do that. We'll need to make sure that we get this in front of the Planning Commission, I believe again. So next steps have changed a little bit, but that's what's ahead. And we will be asking at some point for kind of a blessing to take that next step. They do want to see it once a public facing document is available. So this is sort of in between our land before we go to public hearing. Certainly, you know, way before adoption, they want to be able to kind of chop off and things and give comments. And we want to make sure we do that, but not also skip ahead of council and planning commission before that occurs. So more to come on that stuff. Yeah. Yes.
I think you might have one person. Oh, I was just wondering, it's kind of like, which do you do first? Like, at what point would you want council or planning commission, if they have specific, you know, edits or, hey, could you do this? Like, at what point would that happen?
You know, anytime that you have the opportunity or the, you know, desire to go through it, if you find typos or anything else, we will just take that as it comes. So that's your open invitation, you know, to give comments and things like that. And we track all the comments that come in. So anytime you folks are ready, you know, hey, I'm concerned about this, or I think this needs to be bolstered a little bit more. We're ready for that feedback at any point.
Does it become too late once it gets sent?
Well, no, it's not too late, because this is
even after it comes back.
We're gonna hear back from King County before we get to the public hearing.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just kind of like a first early step to try to get in the door, give them like our first best effort while we're going through with more dialogue with planning commission, council, and then even we're gonna have a community open house as well. That's for our entire comprehensive plan. And so we're just trying to navigate that because it could take up to 5 months for the county to do this work. And so we're technically not ready to get it to the county because we still need to do finish up our capacity analysis on our land use maps, because not only do we get to give them our housing element, but we get to give them a couple of pieces from our land use work as well. So we're getting that work finished over the next week or so, because that information also goes into what our transportation model and our CIPs and all those things. But we're getting super close to be ready to turn in essentially a package to King County. So Naomi now will be working on a memo, like as a written report. Unfortunately, we're not going to meet the next council because our stuff's due already. And so I might have to talk a little bit about maybe under the administrator's report and then ask those that weren't able to meet with us to go back, and we'll get the link up right away for the meeting and then start to provide us some comments. And then I think by 9/2, which is our first 9/3, I think, is our meeting in September. It's probably at that point where we're gonna want to then get ourselves in line at the county, because we will get a review letter. Nicole and I have been watching what's been going through, like not even half the cities are through the county process. So I think they're gonna get a ton of us coming and knocking at their door in September and for sure by October. So we're looking at finishing our parks, trails, and open space plan this year, finishing our capital facilities plan this year, and finishing our transportation plan this year, and then not being able to fully finish our comp plan until probably likely the end of the first quarter of next year. Because once we get review comments back from King County, we need to come back and talk about that letter and see what changes that we might want to make, or do we need to have another conversation with the county? Because not everybody understands our local context, and that's gonna be the most important piece that we're gonna tell our story going into the county. Because we're just not gonna be able to meet some of the pieces that are required, because they looked at such a high level, right, those numbers. And having that dialogue, I think, you know, we'll be able to get there with that 0 to 30%. We're still gonna have to take some numbers and try to figure out how to plan for that. But I think that over 30 to, 80%, we're probably gonna have to figure it out. And 60% to 80% is easier. So just trying to figure out what can we do and where can we do it? Because they're not gonna be okay with us just saying, sorry, we can't do it. We're gonna have to have that story prepared. And so we're gonna have to be prepared to figure out where can we do certain things and how much of it can we do.
I really appreciate all the work that goes into this. I think affordable housing is such a complicated issue. If it was easy, we wouldn't be talking about it right now. It would be all solved. And I think your list of potential barriers really emphasizes the why it's so complicated. And while a lot of communities share similar threads, things in common, it really is a unique set of solutions for each community. And I say set of solutions because of all these proposed policy changes, not one of them will get us to 100%. You really have to do a lot of them. One might get you to 10% or 15 or 5 or something like that. So it can be discouraging at first thinking, well, should we really put our eggs in this basket because it's not going to fix all the problems. You really have to look at that collection, and that's what this does. And so I really appreciated the approach. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Are we ready to move on to new business?
So technically we can't do anything because planning commission doesn't have a quorum.
I can't even adjourn then.
And so Robin's gonna. So I think what you can say is that we are closing our gathering.
Discussion, we are no longer gathering. Gather
7:54 p.m.
at 7:54. Gather elsewhere, not together. Pick a spot in town. But no one else.
Right? I know, I've never heard of that.
Gathering.
Right, like in the